welcome to the podcast. My name's James, and today we're going to talk about the element of air. So, the last two episodes we've talked about fire, what it means, how it works, the kind of ways it kind of operates within a birth chart, and what it means for us on a personal level. And so I want to do the same for air today. Obviously, we're going to move through all the elements, but we're just going to finish off the fire-air polarity. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to look at it from the perspective of kind of what air is in a real sense first, and see what we can kind of learn from that. Since in a lot of ways, it's a very archetypal kind of, representation of the actual astrology part. So, what can we learn or think of when we think of what is air? Well, there's a handful of things that I think really, as we think about it, we'll kind of come across. Because air is a little less intuitive than fire. Fire is very obvious in kind of its meanings and application, but air is a little more subtle. So the very first thing is that it is invisible, right? We can't see air. We can see its effects, but we can't see it specifically, right? If we look out on a windy day, we can see the wind blowing the trees or the flags or whatever, things getting caught in the wind, but we can't actually see the wind. So that's the first thing. Second thing is it's everywhere, right? It's all around us at all times, unless we go underwater, right? We go into space, but for the most part, it's everywhere. The last, or not last thing, but one of the next thing is that it's directional. And I want to explain this. So if we think of wind for a moment, wind moves in a direction. It's always kind of blowing from north to south, east to west, whatever it is. And you tend to see, especially in certain parts of the world, during different seasons, you tend to see the wind blow in from a specific kind of direction all the time. So wind is directional. And another aspect of that is if we watch, like, for example, in the U.S., if you go to the very center of the country, you actually get air from different other parts of the country all converging, right? So you get cold air from the north, you get dry, hot, maybe sometimes cold air from the west, from the Rockies, and then you got hot, humid air coming off from the south. And so these kind of all meet in the center around Kansas, Oklahoma, and that's what creates Tornado Alley. You get this convergence of all these different types of air, and it becomes this very turbulent weather, right? And so air has this quality to it where it can kind of take on different temperaments, and as it interacts with other air, right, it can cause chaos. It can cause storms. And so air has this quality, but it's very directional. If it's converging, it means it's moving in a particular direction. So I want to really emphasize that directional quality of air has the ability to move things. I would also note that if we think about fire, I think I mentioned this in the fire episode, but fire needs to continually find fuel. If you have stagnant air, fire will not really be able to move quickly beyond what it's immediately touching. But when the wind picks up and starts to blow, it can spread the fire very quickly and move it along much further than it would naturally go. So air, in a lot of ways, kind of directs fire or allows it to spread, right? And if we think of fire as motivation, energy, right, air has the ability to spread this motivation. And this is going to lead us into our next quality, which is the idea of transference. So we think of the wind, for example, or air. It transfers things, right? Obviously, during the spring, we have pollen, things like that. But then, additionally, air has humidity to it, right? Certain places, it's much more humid, particularly the south and the east in the United States. Right, places around the equator tend to be very humid. But what is humidity? It's the amount of water within the air, essentially. It's more nuanced than that, but that's kind of the gist of it, right? So there's water in the air, right? You feel this precipitation on you, and so that's why it feels humid. And so or air has this ability to kind of carry that. If we also think of the water cycle, right? You have water on the ground, the sun heats it up, it evaporates and goes where? Into the sky, right? Into the air, where it slowly cools off and condenses and comes back down as rain or snow or hail, what have you. And so air has this quality of being able to kind of move and transfer water and carry water, and it tends to have a lot of water in it. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's a little more dry, right? So those are kind of the main qualities. I think one other thing I want to start with as we kind of unpack what this all means is, if I want to speak, what happens? I have to project air out of my body, and it vibrates along my vocal cords, right? And that's what creates the sound. So sound actually moves through air very easily. It does not move particularly well through water, and it moves even less so through solids. I may have that backwards. I haven't studied physics in a while, but it does move the best through air, though, right? And so air transmits sound. What is sound? Sound is the ability to communicate some form of information, right? A sound wave. When we are speaking, what are we doing? We are projecting ourselves outward. Let's think about this for a sec. If I have thoughts and ideas, and I want to get it out into the world so that other people can have those same thoughts or ideas, or even if I want to express my emotions, right? What do? We talk, we communicate. And so us doing that is an extension of ourselves, right? I am putting my thinking, my emotion, right, out into the world where other people can now take it and react to it. They can do their own thing with it, right? Maybe they attack me for it. Maybe they support me for it. Maybe they agree with me, disagree with me. Maybe they want to take the idea and try and make it a practical thing, implement it. Whatever it is, whatever they want to do with it. But I have put myself out into the world. Something I haven't really discussed yet is this idea of masculinity and femininity within the birth chart. And astrologically speaking, what is the dynamic of masculinity and femininity? Well, masculine signs, which is the fire and the air signs, they project outward into the world, right? That's why they are masculine. If you think of, at a very basic level, if you think of genitalia, what do, right? The male genitalia projects out, female kind of projects in, right? Or recedes in, however you want to describe it. One is moving out and the other is receiving, right? So in that same way, the masculine signs have that quality. They project out into the world. In the case of the fire signs, it's I'm out doing my thing. Not really concerned for the rest of the world unless it's something I'm touching and I need to deal with, right? But it's my own personal kind of motivation. Whereas the air signs are more of a projection of ourselves out into the world. It's not me doing something. It's me projecting my thoughts, my thinking. There was a religious group I was with at one point in time. No longer with them, but something they taught that always kind of stuck with me is they had this idea that words are spirit. And they had their own theological reasons for that. But just thinking about that idea always kind of struck me, because if we say that words are spirit, well, who are we as humans? We have, at least most people consider us to have some kind of soul or kind of spiritual element to us, right? Some consciousness, however you want to describe it. And if we're, as I said, if we're thinking and we're putting thoughts to word, whether it's written communication, whether it's spoken communication, what are we doing? We're putting our spirit out into the world, in a sense. We're projecting it outwards. And so that's what the air signs really want to do, is they want to have this idea of projection into the world. Not me going into the world per se, but me projecting myself into the world for the world to interact with. And so in that way, air signs are going to represent, or a big piece of them is communication, speech. Written communication as well, I think, to a certain extent, because again, it's putting my thought, my idea, my spirit, if you will, out into the world. A piece of that dynamic, then, if we take that a little further, right? If I'm putting my thought into the world, that also implies that I am thinking, right? I'm rationalizing. I have some kind of plan in place, or maybe no plan, and I'm just aimlessly projecting. But that extension on that idea is that the air signs also represent intellect. They represent the ability to rationalize and to think. And I want to be very clear, there is an issue with the air signs that they run into, in that they are intellectual, but not necessarily practical. Right? We talked last week about the fire signs and how the fire signs, by their nature, they have the earth signs in the second house to them. So what is it they acquire by being out in the world? They acquire practical experience. They acquire practical and physical goods because they go out and do, right? They're motivated. The air signs don't have this dynamic. It's flipped, actually, if we look at a chart, right? Because the air signs are always opposite to the fire signs. And so the air signs, by their nature, don't have this sense of practicality to them. That doesn't mean they're completely impractical. But they have this dynamic where they can be very logical, very rational, but not really have any standing in regards to the physical world. Let me give a more concrete example of this. So if we look at academia, right? At least in the United States, what is it required to become a teacher? Well, you got to go to school, obviously graduate high school, you got to go to college, and you can get a, major in, say, if you want to be a math teacher, maybe you'd major in math, major in history, right? If you want to be a history teacher. But you can also get a teaching major, right? But either way, you major in something, and then the next step is you get your teaching credentials. And then you go and you apply for a job at a school. And so in that way, you've now put yourself in a position where the only experience in the field that you have is from teaching, is from education, academics, right? And you see this same process play out for universities, right? Somebody wants to become a university professor. What do? A lot of the time, they go to school, they get their bachelor's, they keep going, they get their master's, maybe then they start working for their PhD. Typically, while people are doing that, they're going to work in some kind of academic job, maybe researching something. But it's all surrounded by academics. It's all dealing with academics and academic type thinking-oriented fields. And so what you get is you get professors, and this is not always the case, obviously, there's exceptions, but a large majority of the time you get people who get into their tenures as a professor having never actually worked in the field that they're theoretically teaching about, right? They have no practical experience within the field. All of their experience is theoretical. It's rational in nature. It's intellectual in nature. And so you can have this dynamic where the air signs have this built up heavy set of intellect, but without the practical application of it, the understanding of the practical application. Now, I think a very good example of this is we look at United States Congress, or just political kind of positions generally. If you look at the work history of a lot of politicians in the country, what do you see? They're people who went to school, studied law, a lot of the time, not always, but most of the time, and then got a job or studied, political science, what have you, and then get a job pretty much immediately working for the government in some capacity, right? And, got their feet wet kind of working as a campaign person for a different politician, and then just work their way up through the political system. And so then you get into a situation like we have now, where the vast majority of people in Congress, working for the federal government, have no real practical experience working in the fields that they're theoretically writing laws for, which is part of why lobbying exists and has caused mayhem in the country. So you get people writing laws about stuff that they've never done. And so this is the big challenge for the air signs, is they can get really wrapped up in their thinking, wrapped up in their ideas, when their ideas may not work in practice, right? It sounds great in theory, works good on paper, but it might not work in practice, right? And so this is a big challenge for the air signs. They have to make sure that they don't get hemmed in by only looking at the theoretical, the rational, the logical. You got to look at the practical as well. And where does practical come from? Right? It comes from doing. It comes from actually accomplishing things. Right? And that's where the fire signs come in, because the fire signs want to do. The other piece of that dynamic is that the air signs naturally, because they're about thinking and communicating, want to, think and communicate. And thinking and communicating does not actually accomplish anything. We can sit and we can, win arguments, right? Say, again, politics is a very easy example for this. We look at a lot of politicians, and there's always this battle in the media, right? We have a bunch of, things like on CNN, Fox News, whatever, where they'll have political debates. They'll have shows that are purely just people talking and debating. And, there's this kind of big, you have a lot of kind of congressional hearings and things like that, where the whole goal is to effectively win the war of words. But winning the war of words doesn't actually put policy in place. It doesn't really accomplish much, And so this is a part of the problem with the air signs. They don't do anything. They just think and they plan. But that thinking and that planning and that rationalization is needed so that when you actually do something, there's some semblance of, hey, I'm actually going to go somewhere because we thought it through, right? So that's the first major aspect, is this idea of thinking, and then by extension, projecting that thinking outwardly. All right, so as far as invisible, obviously if the air signs are about intellect and communication, that's obviously a very invisible thing. It's not something you can see tangibly, right? So it's a pretty easy thing to remember. Another aspect I mentioned was that the air signs are everywhere. And so let's unpack this for a second. If we think of the fire signs, right? Fire signs are very individual. It's about our personal motivation. Well, the air signs being everywhere implies that they are collective in nature. They are about society, right? Socializing. They are about other people. And as a result, that means the air signs naturally have a very strong affinity for society more generally. They want to deal with people. They don't want to deal with the individual per se, unless it's kind of, like I said, intellectual. They want to deal with lots of other people and take the group into account. Each of the signs in their kind of own way, they all go about it. But they're all other people-centric. I was going to get to this later, but if we look at where Leo is for the air signs, right? Because Leo is about self-expression in the chart, wherever it's at. How does a particular sign self-express? So we look to Leo to find that. Where is Leo for the air signs? It's always going to be in either the 7th, the 3rd, or the 11th houses. Those are the houses that deal with what? They deal with society, right? Or other people. 7th house being partnerships, the 11th house being friends, followers, communities, and the 3rd house being the people around us, as well as close, relatives, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles. So the air signs express through other people. They're very other people-centric. Now, I mentioned that air has direction to it, right? Actually, let's talk about this transference first, right? I mentioned both humidity, right? Air carries water around with it, but then also air can kind of carry things, right? Pollen, blowing dust, etc. What does that imply? It implies words are able to carry the other qualities within the birth chart, right? The other aspects within the zodiac. What do I mean? Well, let's think humidity for a moment. What is humidity? It means there's water in the air, right? Which causes us to sweat. It can be very uncomfortable when it's very hot. But water represents, in a lot of ways, emotions, spirituality. It's about connecting, right, on a more emotional and kind of deep level. And so the air signs are able to transmit this. They can carry, when you have very humid air, it means, at least from a astrological perspective, what do you have? You have a very emotionally charged set of communication, right? Or intellectual thought that's very emotionally charged. It's got a lot of water in it. Additionally, air can transmit things. I already mentioned that, right? We think of wildfires, they're spread by high wind. So air has this quality of being able to transmit ideas, transmit motivation, spread the motivation around, spread the energy around, spread the emotions around. It can also spread practical ideas around, right? If it deals with society, that also implies it deals with trade, because people trade things, right? We exchange things. That's one of the main benefits of working as a collective, is we're able to trade not only ideas and new ways of doing things, but we can actually trade physical goods, right? I have a bushel of corn, right? The other person has a sack of potatoes. Hey, let's trade some of it. Now I have potatoes and corn, you have potatoes and corn, right? Or whatever. So air deals with this ability to transmit, to transfer, to spread things around. That's a really key quality to the air signs. They want to kind of work harmoniously to allow everything to kind of connect in a way. But it's not connection like the water signs. Water signs want to connect on a very deep emotional level, right? There's a sense of, I really am now bound to this thing with the water signs. But the air signs, the connection is more surface level, right? Like I said, it's about, hey, I want to spread these things around. I don't necessarily want to have this like deep tie to it. If we think about this idea of spreading motivation for a second, there's a quote. I want to say it's by Lenin, but I might be wrong. I should have looked this up before I started the recording. But there's a quote that says, if you repeat a lie long enough, it becomes the truth, or something to that effect, right? And this is the idea that words are extremely powerful. If we're projecting ourselves outward, right, via communication, it has tremendous ability to move things, to change things over time. It's not immediate, but it is going to have an effect over time. And this can also, again, with this idea of spreading wildfire, right? If you have somebody who's really passionate about something, you can use effective speech to spread that passion, spread that energy, really rile up a populace if you need to. And so words or air signs have this huge ability to spread things in a way that can be very positive, but also very, very negative at the same time. You can whip up a crowd into a frenzy, right? Alternatively, you can get movements going that are very peaceful, and can impact and make great change. So the air signs act as this kind of transference of things and setting these things into motion. They're the ones that kind of shape and guide, but they're not the ones that do. One other thing, and this is kind of leading into it a little bit, is this idea of directionality. Right, I mentioned wind moves in a direction, right? And that's this idea of the air signs kind of guide, and they're about planning and strategizing, is because they move in a direction, right? They're trying to get from point A to point B. The air signs aren't going to do it themselves. They're going to find ways to get society to do it, right? To motivate, whatever. And so that's what the air signs are really trying to do. They have this direction, which means they have this idea, this plan that they want to go about, right? If they're referring to intellectual things and thinking, right? Obviously, we're going to think through, how do I want to, if I want some food, how am I going to get it, right? I mentioned when you have air that's different temperaments, and it kind of all comes together, you get a storm, or right in the Midwest, you get a lot of tornadoes, kind of crazy weather. And that's what happens when we see air coming from different directions, we see that clash, right? So if we think of a storm, what we're seeing in an astrological sense is we're seeing different ideas coming together and clashing. If we look at the politics of the country right now, right? We just had an assassination of a conservative figure. I'm not going to talk about it in this podcast, but that has been divisive. And I mean, even the last several years have been very divisive politically. People have different ideas. And so we're seeing these different ideas coming together, and it's kind of causing turbulence, causing this storm of ideas, right? That's having bigger implications on the real world, right? Obviously, someone was just killed over it. And so the air signs have this ability to cause this chaos when you have people from different backgrounds who have different beliefs, whether it's an individual or, some group or some country, where they put forth you're projecting your spirit outward, and not everyone's the same, right? And so these things all kind of come together, and boom, now we have a storm brewing, right? Different things come together, you get different kinds of storms. But it's, again, directional, because the wind is trying to push in one direction, right? It's trying to go north, but then you get that dry wind from the east that's trying to go west, or whichever, right? And then it kind of mingles together, and now you got to figure out a new thing. So that's the basic framework of the air signs. If we look at them in terms of the chart, right? Actually, let's hold off on that. I think I might do that in the next episode. How are we doing on time? It's a pretty long episode so far. If we think of the... you know what? I think in the next episode, we'll stop here because it's getting kind of long. In our next episode, we will look at how the air signs look in a birth chart in terms of the houses, right? I already mentioned fire being in the 3rd, 7th, and 11th, but we'll look at the other elements. And then I also want to look at what happens when we don't have much air, or when we have too much air, and what that kind of implies. So we'll look at that in our next episode. So again, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and I will see you in the next episode.